This video is going to be very quick. I want to provide a straightforward analysis of the two fundamental perspectives on the situation in Ukraine as it relates to U.S. involvement. Some people think we should be doing more to actively resist Putin, and other people think we should be doing more to de-escalate this conflict, even if that means acquiescing to whatever Putin's demands are. I'm of the second opinion, which is that we should be looking to de-escalate and not resist Putin to the point of, all-out warfare, and I'll get into why. And I just want to say this up front. Foreign policy issues are the most complicated and difficult to talk about, I think, because there's no way to approach them other than a very cynical and morally detached way. Like, for example, the U.S. provides military weapons to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia commits all kinds of human rights violations and arguably a genocide in Yemen. And if you're trying to take a principled approach on this issue, which is what I try to do, you would say, hey, we should stop funding countries engaging in genocide. But the cynical complexity that comes up is that because we sell military equipment to Saudi Arabia, they become permanently reliant on us for all of the parts and the maintenance equipment that goes in all of the tanks and helicopters and all that. And so we get to exercise leverage over them. If we stopped selling military equipment to the Saudis, guess who would come in and sell them military equipment? Putin or China. And then the genocide and human rights violations would continue, but the only thing that would be different is instead of us influencing Saudi Arabia, it's now under the influence of China or Russia, which would make things in the Ukraine even more complicated and difficult. So the first question is, why did Putin invade Ukraine to begin with? And I'm going to let Ryan Chapman explain the situation from Putin's perspective.
Putin's third argument is that Russia is threatened and has a right to react. This argument centers around NATO and is about NATO's expansion towards Russian borders. Putin argues that if Ukraine were to join NATO, and if it were equipped with modern missile technology, it would then pose an existential threat to Russian security.
And the travel time of the Tomahawk missiles to Moscow will be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles, 7-8 minutes. And the hypersonic offensive weapons, 4-5 minutes. That's like having a knife against our throat.
And he even cites international law to say that one country can't enhance its own security at the cost of the security of another country.
In international law, it says there is a principle of indivisible security, which states that one country cannot enhance its security at the expense of the security of others.
And then specifies that he's talking about Ukraine.
And if Ukraine was to join NATO, would serve as a direct threat to the security of Russia.
For quick background, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed during the Cold War as a coalition against the Soviet Union. And at the time, obviously, it made sense to be part of that. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO continued to self-propagate, and it is centered around resistance against now Russia. And so Putin does not want Ukraine to be part of NATO, where NATO can move military installations in and be within striking distance of Russia. And so he invaded the region to supposedly defend himself from that possibility. And just to steelman Putin for a second, let's say Canada wanted to join the Warsaw Pact, which was the Russian equivalent of NATO at the time. And let's say Warsaw Pact was still around. It would obviously be in the US's interests to not let that happen. And so there's a reasonable argument to be made about self-defense. Now, of course, the invasion of a sovereign country is a violation of international treaty. And so Putin is very clearly in the wrong here. But on the question of what should the US do, I think it is a terrible idea to even consider, well, let's send U.S. troops into Ukraine or something like that. We have no treaty obligation to defend them. Ukraine is not part of NATO. And unless we are interested in pursuing a full-scale war with a nuclear power who is also armed with significant cyber warfare capabilities, which if we got in a serious conflict with Russia, they could actually launch cyber attacks here domestically in the U.S. and shut down hospitals and power grids and all of that. And it could get very bad very quickly. So I think the United States should not try to be the world policeman and should not get involved in a war in Europe. We can definitely do sanctions and we can continue to, send military weapons and whatnot to NATO since we are part of it. And then NATO can provide peripheral support to Ukraine. But we have to have a door open for diplomacy and to bring Putin to the table and say something to the effect of, look, you have to pull out of Ukraine and we will make a binding agreement that Ukraine will not be part of NATO and we will not move military installations within striking distance of the Russian capital. And one reason I really think the onus is not on the U.S. to get involved is because this conflict was in part facilitated by incompetence of the European Union, who have allowed themselves to become energy dependent on Russia and have built pipelines directly from Russia to Germany and are now basically in Russia's hands.
The strongest power in Europe, Germany, is in a really difficult situation because they rely on Russian energy. 50% of the nat gas that comes in, or 50% of the energy, I think, that comes into Germany is from Russia. And they've, in fact, been building an entire pipeline system from Russia that bypasses the Ukraine and goes straight to Germany. And so when all of this saber rattling was happening, Germany basically had to blink because they need Russia's energy. And why did they need Russia's energy? Well, they needed Russia's energy because 20 years ago, the environmentalists in Germany won and they started to decommission all their nuclear reactors. Somewhere along the way, nobody took a science class in Germany and figured out that nuclear was both safer and cleaner. Instead, burning fossil fuels was the answer.
Wiser to not have a dependency.
So it looks like the Russians are having a lot of difficulty in Ukraine and things are not going as expected. And what that means is the more pressure gets put on Putin, the more he has pressure to come to the table and negotiate. And we have to be willing to offer something to de-escalate this conflict. And again, it's absolutely sickening that, young men are dying and women and children are dying. But because foreign policy requires you to take a cynical approach because there's all kinds of brutality all throughout the world and we can't just be the policeman that ends it all, we have to be very practical. And the number one goal we need to have is de-escalation. And if it means that Ukraine loses out on the opportunity to join NATO, I don't see any other reasonable solution other than warfare, which is not a reasonable solution. So those are my perspectives. I'm curious to know what everyone else thinks. And to everyone, good luck and Godspeed.